Let's talk a little bit about whether or not it's okay to wish bad things on bad people. This is an interesting question that it came up for obvious reasons. Glenn Greenwald wrote an article about this, and Greenwald was basically pointing out how ridiculous it is, how hypocritical it is that you have these establishment mainstream Democratic Party pundits, like the MSNBC host, for example, who are totally convinced that Trump is like Hitler. He's a Nazi, he's a white supremacist, he's a white nationalist, he's one of the worst monsters in history. But then they also turned around as soon as they realized he had COVID and they wished for a speedy recovery. And he was pointing out that that really doesn't make sense. Because that is, in their conception of the world, that's literally like wishing Hitler a speedy recovery. So he wrote an article on this. He documented the things that all these people were saying. I found it very interesting. I have to be honest, though, I also find it interesting what the left does. So those are the Democratic Party hacks. The left, I've seen plenty of people on the left who are like, yeah, fuck him. Hope he dies a slow, painful death. And so the reason I wanted to talk about this is because I had a curious, like, reflexive response to both of those things. So when it came to, like, the Rachel Maddow thing where she's saying, we wish you a speedy recovery, good sir. God bless you. We're praying for you. When I read that, I was like, okay, that's a little weird. It was a little fawny, over the top, like going the next mile or going to the next level to be like, I don't want you to be hurt or anything. And so it felt weird and gross when I read that, but I also felt like it was kind of gross when I read people who are like, yeah, fuck them, feel the pain and die. I thought that felt kind of gross too, reading it. So it got me thinking, what do I actually believe about this? What do I actually believe? Do I think that it's generally okay to wish bad things on bad people? Or do I think that in order to be a good person, that means even wishing well on, like, enemies? That you don't want anybody to experience, like, pain, suffering, and things like that. So the first point I'll make is that I think for the Rachel Maddow types, I think they're giving up the game here, and they're almost admitting that they don't really think Trump is like Hitler. Like, that's just their performative thing. That's just how they act. That's part of the game. Like, the game is, oh, we're going to say you guys are like Hitler, and you guys are going to say we're like Hitler. Like, this is the partisan game that we play in this country. So I think that they're kind of admitting that they don't really think he's like Hitler. Do they think he's bad? Of course. Do they think he's horrendous? Of course. But they don't think he's like Hitler. And, you know, on that front, I would argue that's, like, they're right about that. He's not Hitler. Trump is really, really, really bad, and he's a war criminal, and he's got blood on his hands, and he's ushering in, you know, climate apocalypse, all these terrible things. But is he really as bad as Adolf Hitler? No, I don't think almost anybody's as bad as Adolf Hitler. So no, I don't. Sorry. Some of you might vehemently disagree with that. I think you got a tough argument to make to really make that case convincingly. I think you got a tough argument to make. Now, I think that Maddow and her ilk think that it makes them better people than right-wingers. So, like, a lot of people on the far right celebrated Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death. Or they, like, you know, they wish harm or wish death on, like, Barack Obama, for example. Or if you read Ilhan Omar's mentions, it's nonstop people wishing her death. And I think that Maddow and people like her think, oh, we're the better people, we're the more civil people because we don't wish ill on our political enemies. So this makes us better than the right-wingers. I think there's an element of that in there too. And I gotta be honest, man, my main takeaway is I really don't know what I believe. Like, I think that generally, you shouldn't rejoice in anybody's pain except in the most extreme cases. And when I say the most extreme cases, I mean like Hitler. But then of course you get into the conversation of, is it reasonable for anybody to view Trump as Hitler? Certainly some people, I think it's perfectly reasonable. Like, so for example, if you're a victim of one of his drone strikes, killed your family members, is that person totally justified in like wishing the pain on him with COVID? Yeah, I think that person would be. So I also, obviously, I think context matters here. To some people, you could say he's like Hitler. To others, not really, and it's a big stretch to say he's as bad as Hitler. But yeah, generally, my take on it is, if somebody's just a regular asshole and you wish pain on them, I think you're the bigger asshole. You know what I mean? Like, if somebody... Take your personal life, your private life. You have a family member who is always a dick, okay? And then something happens to them, they're in a lot of pain, terminal illness, or they die. And you're like celebrating it. If somebody's just run-of-the-mill dick, run-of-the-mill asshole, and you're like, they got what they deserved, I kind of think you're a worse person. Because run-of-the-mill assholery is just par for the course, and you don't know what's going on in that person's life. You don't know what happened to them that led them to be how they are. You don't know if it was malicious intent on their part against you, if you felt like they were rude to you throughout your life. And so there's a lot of that going on where, like, I think some people are too loose with being jovial at other people's pain. And one of the things that comes to my mind is, like, I want the best even for people I hate. Like, I want a Medicare for All system that covers Ben Shapiro and Steven Crowder if they get hurt or if they get sick. And this vindictive streak that some people have leads me to believe that there are plenty of people who are like, yeah, I want Medicare for All, but if somebody really disagrees with me, then they can go fuck themselves, and I don't care if they get the treatment that they deserve. I don't care if, they get treated properly. It's like, no, if you really believe these things as a matter of principle, I think everybody should have health care, then yes, you mean it even if it's the Boston Marathon bomber and he gets sick and he's behind bars. Like, yeah, he did a terrible thing, but that doesn't mean that you can deny people human rights. And so in a way, I do think it's almost tied to the discussion about human rights. And it's like, because a lot of these arguments sound to me like the old George W. Bush argument and the Dick Cheney argument and the Republican argument of like, yeah, but these people are so bad that they deserve to be locked up and have no trial and get tortured. Like, the mindset is, let's throw out the civil liberties and protections and humanity when it's convenient. And I feel like there are people who are too quick to rejoice in the suffering of others where that's what they're doing. They're willing to let go of their principles, their morality, their ethics for this like visceral, base, positive feeling in the suffering of somebody else. And I do think that probably makes you a shitty person too. So that's why I say this is a complicated issue though, because yes, in the most extreme examples, I think it's perfectly reasonable to celebrate their pain like somebody like Hitler. So I don't know, man. That's why I'm talking about this. I'm talking about this in front of you guys because I'm conflicted and I want to kind of air it out. But I polled this question and the numbers were absolutely overwhelming. It was like, I believe it was like 59% or 60% of you said that it's okay to rejoice in the suffering of others. Actually, I'm gonna give you the exact wording because I took a lot of time to really lay it out in a way that I thought was fair. Okay. What do you think? Is it okay to celebrate in the pain/suffering or death of generally terrible people? 59.9% of you said yes, it is okay. It was only 16% who said no, and then 24.1% said torn/ I'm not sure. And there were 29,119 people who voted in it. That's pretty overwhelming for yes. But I will say this. if like when Bernie Sanders passes away and you get people on the far right who are celebrating it, everybody who said yes here is going to flip on that principle. All of you are going to be like, that's disgusting. These people are disgusting. How dare you do that? Now, you might say, well, yeah, that's because Bernie's a good person, so, it's categorically different. But the reality is there are plenty of people out there who view Bernie as the embodiment of evil. Now, they're wrong. I think they're wrong. You think they're wrong. They're wrong. But once you agree to the principle of, oh, it's okay to celebrate in the pain and suffering of generally terrible people, well, then everything hinges on the definition of what a terrible person is, and there are plenty of people who disagree with you and me as to who's a terrible person. So my guess is, if Bernie Sanders dies and far-right people start celebrating his death, the 60% of people who are like, yeah, celebrate the death of terrible people, all of a sudden, all of them will clutch their pearls and be like, how dare you, good sir? And yeah, so I feel like people are going to be hypocrites on this because it all depends on whether or not they like the person, whether or not they approve of the person. And there's obviously colossal disagreement across society as to who's good, who's bad, who's terrible, who's not. So yeah, I don't know. I honestly, I swear to you guys, what I generally try to do is not rejoice in the suffering of other people, especially not regular schmegular assholes. Yes, you can. I saved the little asterisks for the worst monsters in history, but then again, the conversation becomes who constitutes the worst monsters in history. Does Trump make that cut? Again, I think there's a reasonable argument, yes, he does, and I think there's a reasonable argument, no, he doesn't. So I don't know. I think this is a complex issue, and I guess the thing that gets under my skin more than anything is the people who have really hard answers on this, like Rachel Maddow, who clearly believes, like, no, never celebrate in anybody's suffering, and my God, good sir, get better so you can keep the kids in camps and keep doing terrible Nazi war crimes. Her strong opinion on that is like really insufferable because it strikes me as just like performative and reflexive and unthoughtful. But I also do think that the left reaction where it's like all the left is doing is pointing out how dumb the Democrats are and the liberals are, but like they're casually all gleeful in somebody's suffering. And I do think that's equally unthoughtful. And it's just like, oh, is that what everybody's doing now today? Then fine, let's do that. Well, if 2 weeks ago, if people were doing that in the wake of RBG's death, everybody was clutching their pearls and saying, how dare you rejoice in somebody's death? So people are willing to flip on that principle so quickly. And that's annoying. So anyway, I think that the thing that got under my skin is the people who have hard opinions on this one way or the other. Like, of course, be joyous in somebody suffering. Duh. That aren't I? Can I still be a good person as I do that? Maybe. It depends. Depends on a lot. But the hardcore takes on this are the ones that get under my skin. I feel like it's actually a really sticky, difficult conversation to have. My instinct is to say, most of the time, do not ever rejoice in somebody's pain, because that kind of makes you shitty. But again, you got to leave the caveats for like the worst monsters, in which case it's perfectly reasonable. If somebody murdered your family and then they get the death penalty, am I going to begrudge you being like, fuck that guy? Of course not. Of course not. But I guess the bubble cases are the tough one. Donald Trump is horrendous. He's terrible. Is he as bad as Hitler? No, he's not. Does he make the cut of like, okay, you could rejoice in his suffering? Debatable. I think it's debatable. I actually would argue George W. Bush makes that cut a lot easier than Trump. That George W. Bush is worse than Trump, and I would get the rejoicing more. When George W. Bush or Dick Cheney dies, I feel like they're a little more comfortably making the cut where it makes sense to be like, I'm not shedding a tear. But that's like, that might be the extent of how far I go too, by the way, is I never really rejoice in somebody's suffering. But like when Dick Cheney dies, it's just going to be like, I'm going to feel exactly the same as I did the day before. Like I'm not going to be dancing in the street or anything, but I'm going to be like, who cares? You know? And I feel like maybe, who knows, maybe I just have that thing that you could argue it's a liberal thing. I would argue it's more of a principled thing of like, I think you cross a line into ugly territory, generally speaking, when you're willing to play around with who's worthy and who's not worthy of basic decency, rights, civil liberties, so on and so forth. So as you could tell, I think it's a complex conversation. I don't think I necessarily resolved anything by talking about this on air and giving you guys my take, but I did kind of want to air it out here because a lot of the dialogue around this has annoyed the shit out of me. A lot of the people with like firm answers and yeah, I don't get it. And I think that even if you have a firm answer, you'd probably flip pretty quickly if we just change the person whose death is being celebrated or whose pain is being celebrated.